Generic greetings! Welcome to Science Insanity, this delightful podcast show video thing where I cover anything and everything from all of my favorite science fiction universes with our lovable tag-along Steve, an absolute science idiot who we are educating in the ways of turbo nerd culture. He is both a stand-in for the general audience that knows nothing about sci-fi, and also, he's my comedic relief. Say hello, Steve.
Hello.
Never gonna change. Classic entrance.
Never.
So, today we are going to be going over the production and development of mechs. Not like their super huge history, because I don't have the patience to talk about the development from the age of the Mackie. Instead, we're talking about the nerdiest thing you possibly can. We're going over logistics and industry, baby. The one thing that nobody ever wants to talk about it, but we're gonna do it because it's awesome. I don't care what anyone else says. I will geek out to my heart's content. So what are we going to be covering? We're going to be talking about how mechs are constructed, from the framing to the internal components to the different ways that they're actually built, and then we're going to be covering how they're maintained. And then that's pretty much it. So, excited?
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
We're going to be starting off by going over what resources are needed to build mechs. Firstly, an unholy amount of fusible nuclear material to power the reactors, an incredible amount of rare materials and metals, minerals specifically, because the armor plating isn't just steel. They don't just slap on whatever the thickest metal they can. It's kind of the same thing like real-life armored vehicles. They use really advanced composites with everything from iron to silicon to heavy rare metals, and in some cases even depleted uranium for armaments and armor. So there's an enormous amount of resources that go into just mining shit. And this is why, for the most part, mechs are so difficult to build and so resource intensive in 3025. Even the great houses, with all of their insane resources and all of their ridiculous wealth, struggle to find all the raw materials that they need and get them to the factories and refining plants in order to actually get going. Fun fact, did you know that's why most of the periphery regions are generally insignificant? Even though a lot of them have like an enormous amount of territory, they don't have the industry or the population to generate the raw materials to actually build battle mechs, which is why for the most part, they use older, outdated versions that they buy from the great houses, or they just have absolute shit piles that they've cobbled together from whatever they can find.
It makes sense since you're explaining this stuff now, but yeah. We'll say yes, I did know.
Yeah, yes, you didn't know. So, imagine just like, in general, it's like a small mountain worth of raw material that you need to mine out of the ground that goes into actually making like a decent number of battle mechs. We'll start with, you know what? I was gonna go on like the most complicated to least complicated, but no, let's just start with what they build first. The very first thing that's actually built in a battle mech before anything else is assembled is the fusion engine and the power plant, because those things are the heaviest part of the battle mech, they make up the majority of the mass, and they are the most delicate and important thing to get right, because remember, in Battletech, you are basically driving around on top of a nuclear bomb whenever you're inside of a mech. These things are fusion powered.
I have an objection.
Objection noted. Continue.
Typically, the first thing that's going to be built that's inside of the mech is the human.
I hate you. Why are you like this? Okay, fine. Two people do the nasty, and then they make a mech pilot. There, whatever, fine.
Okay. There we
All
go.
right, we'll continue on. So the fusion engine is the first thing that's assembled. And in Battletech, believe it or not, a lot of good old companies from real life are still around and kicking. Did you know that good old GM, General Motors, is actually one of the biggest manufacturers of fusion engines and all of the wonderful things like that in Battletech?
I am aware of such things now, yes.
Yeah, it's fantastic. GM went from making trucks and cars and shit to making the engines for unstoppable war machines and said war machines themselves. It's great. The wild
Pretty
west
good.
of capitalism out here. Any company that has the ability can do anything. It's great. So once the fusion engine is actually assembled, Then we move on to proper mech assembly, because you see, the fusion engine requires an enormous amount of shielding to be put all around it to keep the radiation in from the ongoing fusion reaction that happens to power the mech and generate energy, but also it needs an enormous amount of shielding to keep it steady and to keep it in one piece. These components are super heavy, and most of them are aligned very carefully to make sure that it doesn't accidentally melt the first time you turn it on. So there's an enormous amount of structural reinforcement and material built around it to keep it in one piece. Just like you have the giant engine on, for example, a battleship or something, that sucker has a massive armored compartment around it that's basically just there to make sure it stays in one piece and doesn't blow itself to bits.
Be a good way to go about things, yeah.
That would be a good way to go about things, yeah. Unless you'd like a boiler disaster like the Russian aircraft carrier had, where one of its boilers just exploded for no reason.
I mean, that's just a Russian moment right there. Could never happen to a GM product. Certainly.
Okay, yeah, sure. We can go with that. All right, fair enough. Moving on from that, though, once the reactor is actually set up, then mech production begins proper. And even though mechs are extremely difficult to build, and they take a really long time to build, even for like the big super factories of the far future, they're still built on assembly lines, obviously, because it's just more efficient. From this point, now we get to see all of the fancy rigging and equipment that goes into it. You see, a mech bay, which is what is generally used for maintenance on them, has a whole bunch of fancy arms and stuff that lift up the mech, keep it from supporting its own weight, allow people to work on it, etc. And it's the same thing with factory production. The fusion engine is basically mounted onto an overhead carousel, and a whole bunch of technicians and robot arms get to work stapling bits onto it. The next thing that's generally added is, firstly, joints and rotor cuffs, and then myomer anchor points. Remember how we talked about myomer? It's that synthetic muscle, you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. So for a quick redo for anyone that may not know, basically mechs don't use pistons and stuff really in Battletech. They have weird, freaky synthetic muscles that looks like a dude's arm with no skin. It's great. It's freaky. I love it. And the reason that they do this is because they're going to start adding the myomer in and creating all of the joints and stuff for whatever mech they're building. And the reason they actually go about doing this first instead of, for example, tacking on the superstructure for the legs is because the myomer is extremely difficult to work with. In layman's terms, metal cables that react to electricity and contract and expand like a muscle does. If they're not anchored properly, it could tear free and the entire limb would just rip off of the mech, which is a problem some mechs in the Battletech universe have because they were designed really badly.
Basically, it's just a guy on steroids, is what I'm hearing.
Okay, I don't know if it's possible for a human body to rip their leg off when they're running just by the sheer force of muscle, but I'll trust you on that one.
I'm gonna say Arnie was pretty close. I mean,
I feel like Arnie would flex and rip the arm off of someone else, not his own, but it's...
Well, I mean, probably.
What they do here, long story short, is they basically take a box frame and they use that to support the myomer temporarily. So let's say they got the anchor point on the hip, they got the anchor point on the knee, and they have main structural support that goes between the two, right? This is just like raw superstructure of the mech. What they'll do then is they'll put a nice big cage around the outside of that, like a big scaffolding box almost. And this is how they string the myomer on. They'll anchor it to the hip point, and then they'll drag those cables down through the scaffolding to make sure that they're all in the correct orientation, in the correct direction, that kind of stuff. Then they will anchor it to the knee joint, and that will be the front end of the upper part of the leg finished. And they still got to repeat that process several times, because remember, that muscle group, that myomer bundle, is only for moving the knee in one direction, right? You got to put more of them on the back of the leg in order to get it to move the other direction or side to side and all of that. In this image, the legs are done, so you'll notice when you look at it, you don't see that same scaffolding all around it, and that's because, it's done. They got the joints on, they've got the caps on, all the myomer anchors are already set into the mech properly, so it can hold up its own weight now. It's ready to go. The arms and the upper torso, you can see, are still structurally exposed. In fact, the upper torso, if you actually look closely at this, has like nothing on it at all. There's no armor, there's no myomer, it's just raw exposed structure. You can see the ammo feed tubes, you can see the engine housing, you can see all the gribbly bits in there. It's great. And so generally what they'll do is they'll build the legs first, because a mech is extremely heavy, right? Like at the very minimum, you're looking at like 30 tons, and it's kind of difficult to carry that thing around on a suspended hoist. So they build the legs first, and then they start pumping electricity into it in order to get the muscles to work. Now you may be thinking, like, why wouldn't they use the reactor for this, right? Like, it's got a fusion reactor in it, just turn the mech on, and, well, you see... A fusion reactor is a small sun in the chest of your mech. Turning it on when the mech is barely even constructed and standing precariously in the middle of a factory is a really, really fast way to no longer have a factory.
I think it's a really good idea. It's gonna increase production a lot.
Oh yeah, the workers are going to be super motivated to get this thing done and out the door as fast as they possibly can. What a good idea.
Exactly.
Certainly not a way to immediately lead to production faults. No, could never go wrong. Here's another image. So you see those massive tubes that are coming down into the catapult, right? That's what this mech is. Those are there to feed power and stuff into the mech. They'll also be used for fueling the fusion engine, getting the fuel into the actual thing initially for the startup sequence, but when it's still under production, it's feeding power into the mech. And the reason that they do this is because electricity is what causes the myomer to contract, and all mechs are basically required to have some level of electricity to keep themselves upright. Once it's fully built, its engine can basically idle forever because, nuclear reactors just go for all time.
Nuclear reactors go burr.
Yeah, or they just shut it down and they keep it in storage somewhere, but when it's up like this and it needs to be standing, the actual facility feeds energy into the mech to keep it standing upright. And now the technicians can go to work on the rest of the mech, adding in the arms, anything that might be necessary for the torso bits, adding any things on top, yada yada, building out the rest of the superstructure. And another reason why they have to feed power in like this is because when the reactor is on, the mech is basically constantly in a state of stress. So you know how, like, with a human body, your muscles are never actually not working? Even when you're fully relaxed, there's still electrical signals going through them and stuff, right? It's the same.
Right.
It's the same thing with a mech. Once they turn that reactor on, all of the myomer is constantly like on the edge of activation. There are those electrical signals going through the whole thing, right? So if a technician hooks up a bundle of myomer in an arm, for example, and the reactor is on and supplying blanket power to the entire thing, those metal coils might randomly decide to twitch and proceed to bisect the poor guy working on it.
I mean, he wouldn't be very poor for long.
He wouldn't be very anything after a few moments. Imagine like the suspension cable on a bridge snaps and then proceeds to immediately fling itself into a guy's sternum. That's basically the effect that would happen on unsecured myomer if you just ran electrical current through it. And when they move on from that, right, the arms go on next after the side torso and they build out. But once the myomer is on, that's when they start introducing more of the actual systems, because you can't undo the myomer. I think we talked about this in another episode as well, like the difference between omni-mechs and stuff. The reason that there are different versions of mechs is, like, instead of having, just universal weapon pods, they build them with ammo feed and, kinetic weapons in the arms and lasers in the torso or whatever, is because for the most part, once you build a mech, you can't really take the myomer off of it again. It's designed and specifically built to work in that way, and it's extremely dangerous to start cutting into those fibers and ruining them, so only after everything is fully assembled and the raw structure of the mech is working and all of that is on, only then do they start adding in the other systems. And once again, they're going to start with the legs. They're going to add in any other joints or rotors or motors that they may need to into the feet and the legs in order to help with movement and stability. A little bit further up, they might have bearings or whatever on the knees or on the hips that help to move it a little bit or to ease pressure on it. Because in a lot of cases, I believe it was the Fireball? A light mech that was designed to fight the clans and was rushed out, if I'm remembering correctly. And this thing had a nasty habit of its legs locking up and just tripping forward because the myomer would become overstressed and the anchor points would basically seize up, basically having like a seizure almost. And it kind of, didn't turn out well when you're fighting the clans, when your mech just decides it wants to convulse on the ground for a little bit.
I think it's pretty good. I think that's what's going to win you the war, really. For sure.
Maybe you'll squish an elemental if you have a drastically overpowered Myanmar leg, kick him in the chest or something.
Yeah, the clans only had one elemental. Yeah, they didn't have any mechs or anything.
Yeah, I mean, ignoring the fact that elementals can soak missiles to the forehead and not care, but sure. Sure. So once they got all of that stuff done and the other internals start to go in, such as temperature sensors, any vital electronics, or any like electronic warfare equipment, that kind of stuff is in, then they start adding on the beautification process. They take off all of that unnecessary scaffolding all over the mech. They start removing the bits and bobs that don't need to be there, grinding down angles, welding together components that are going to be there permanently, right, after they've assembled them and stuff. And the armor is probably one of the cooler, at least in my opinion, aspects of it, because none of it is designed to permanently be on the mech. We talked about this as well in a prior episode, that the armor is designed to ablate off. It's ablative, right, in the lore. When it gets hit by projectiles or lasers or missiles, the armor will shred apart, and it will absorb the energy of that weapon so that heat and concussive force and stuff isn't transferred to the internals of the mech. In exchange, well, your armor gets weakened every time it's hit, until eventually weak spots form and the enemy will find a way to punch through and kill you.
Basically just a futuristic ERA plating.
Pretty much, yeah. It's actually not a bad way to put it. I think we have another image right here, actually. Oh, here we go. So this is the Hunchback one, right? This is a Hunchback being worked on in a mech bay. This is not... Actually, this might still be in a factory. This image was a little vague. I'm just going to assume that it's still being worked on in the factory.
That looks like a factory to me.
Yeah, that looks more like a factory than a mech bay. But as you can see, right, once they got on, you can see like one of its hands is still really skeletal while the other arm is fully armored. The legs are fully done except for like one part on the shin there. And the torso still has the exposed reactor, right? When the armor goes on, it goes on in big plates. The knees and the joints generally have a different type of armor. They have like a solid, thick hunk of metal that's just designed to absorb hits, not to really melt apart or anything. And that's because they need the joint to stay in one piece. They can't really afford to have the joint armor fall apart whenever it gets shot. But those big, flat, chunky plates you see all over the Hunchback, those go on in big hunks. The entire upper leg segment that you see there is probably only 2 or 3 chunks of armor. One that goes on the front, one that goes on the back, and probably a side piece or like an inner leg piece or something if there's exposed bits from the motor, and then they just weld them together. They'll bolt them, they will joint them, like mortise and tendon joint kind of with the metal, and then they'll weld the whole damn thing together. Because as well, they can't afford for them to be separate pieces. A lot of mechs look like they have segments of armor. They kind of don't. If the armor isn't moving like next to each other, if you can't see the different components moving, then just treat it like one component, because that's probably what it is. Since the armor is designed to fragment off when it gets hit, if they had a billion different little chunks of armor, then that kinetic force would start blasting the joints apart. I think in real life, one of the reasons the Yamato sank is because even though the armor was like the thickest ever, the joints were really shit. And they kept getting hammered by the concussive force of torpedoes, and all the bolts and rivets and stuff were just coming out of the armor. The side of the Yamato literally just fell apart because the joints couldn't stand up to it.
Well, yes, plus the fact that the steel wasn't very good.
Well, I mean, yeah, that as well, right? But to kind of fix that problem, once the armor is on, that's it. It's on the mech. It's a solid chunk of it. The only way it's coming off is for mech techs, this setting's version of an engineer, is to physically cut the armor off, remove the damaged sections, and put new sections on. That's why Battletech nerds, whenever you're playing games like MechWarrior or Rogue Tech or whatever, you have to wait for days, sometimes weeks, for the armor to be repaired if you're playing on realistic settings, because some poor sod has to climb up there, physically cut off the car-sized piece of armor, and then haul a new one up there to replace it.
Maybe they should just be better at their jobs or something. I don't know, man.
I mean, back during the Star League days, the Super Space UN, they were better at it. It was mostly automated, but in the modern day, it's just a bunch of really piss-poor, sad engineers that have to deal with this shit all the time. Poor grease monkeys, man.
Oh, so it's basically just modern day. Cool.
Once all the armor and stuff is on, the very last thing to be closed up on the mech is actually the center torso, because the reactor startup sequence has to be carefully monitored. They have to make sure that they didn't install something incorrectly and it's about to explode, and if they need to, they have to access it like immediately. Again, with that hunchback image, right? You can see, despite the fact that the thing is almost entirely armored up and ready to go, except for the cockpit and the center torso, it's still being fed electricity from the factory because they haven't turned the reactor on yet, right? The reactor is like the last thing that goes up. Believe it or not, actually, almost all mechs, or at least most of like the head engineers that work on mechs and stuff in the factories, are also mech pilots, because just like in good old Soviet Russia, once the crew is done building it, it walks right off the factory by itself. They get the reactor up and running, they get the legs moving, do a rough shakedown of it in the factory, make sure everything is working properly, and then they walk that sucker directly out and move it into either a holding lot or sometimes directly onto a bulk transport to take it to wherever it needs to go. Also, I'm going to throw this out here as a random intermission because I fucking love this. This is a Franken mech. This is so funny. This is like 4 different mechs that they cobbled together into one thing. The upper torso is a Marauder 2. You can see like the cockpit there. It's got a King Crab missile launcher shoulder on like the back. It's got the King Crab arms. I think it has like Warhammer legs, and then like the lower front torso is either like an Awesome or a Hunchback or something. There's like 5 mechs, or maybe like an Atlas. I can't remember. It's like 5 mechs that they threw into it. It's not real, but look at it. It looks so good. That looks like it could actually be a Battletech mech. That looks really good.
I think that's the best looking mech in the universe.
I know you're yanking my chain right now just to agree with me on this bit, but like, come on. Look at it. It's beautiful.
It could be, man. You never know. I haven't seen all of them.
That's true, you haven't, but most of them are fugly. Don't worry. Most of them look really, really bad.
Okay, so I mean, it very well could be the best looking one in the universe. I mean,
yeah, random 5-minute intermission.
We hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed. Random fun thing I'll throw in there. So, after the mech is actually... Oh no, wait, here we go. I have it. Shit, there we go. There's like a holding bay, all right? These are non-work related mech bays, right? And there's a fundamental difference between like a maintenance bay and a storage mech bay, right? This is a storage mech bay. You'll notice that they have a whole bunch of scaffolding and rigging around it, but it's basically just walkways. There's nothing else here. They would walk off a factory, maybe even from the other side of the road there, you can see through the little door. They would walk them into these storage bays, and here the mechs would undergo like final preparations. But for the most part, they just kind of sit here until they're needed or until they're ready for a bulk order, right? Because, you know, moving stuff around in Battletech is really hard. There are very few, you know, big ships that are capable of jumping on their own. So a lot of times what'll happen is, even though the mechs can wander off and go do whatever right after they're finished being built and be pretty much fine, they'll usually sit here in storage with a whole bunch of other mechs, and they'll be shipped off in like a big bulk transport of like 20 or 30 or 40 mechs or whatever, right? Which is... That's a lot of mechs. That's a shitload of them. That's a small army. Once they're actually done, though, then you have to maintain them. You have to keep making sure that they're working properly. You might need to refit them or repair them. And now we get to move on to the second half of the video: maintenance and repair. It's going to be a little funny because it's going to range from professional, interesting, and pretty similar to real life, to just, what are you doing, Billy Bob? Get off the mech's leg, dude. So this is a more classical mech bay. You'll notice in like the back corner, right, there's an Atlas that's got a whole bunch of big ol' orange things tacked all over it and robot arms and stuff. So that is a mech hoist. When you're working on a mech, they turn the reactor off. Again, they'll feed electricity into it from the actual mech bay, but those hoists are specially designed for maintenance. You see, once the mech walks off of the assembly line, it can no longer be stably worked on just randomly without support. You can still do it, but you're running risks, right? Because the structure has kind of settled, it's kind of worked itself in. It's not really a good idea to take off bits and pieces of it or like remove motors and rotors and stuff while the weight of the mech is still bearing down on it. So what they do is they have these giant hoists that tuck underneath the arms, around the hips, that lock onto the joints, and they lift the mech. Not straight off the ground, they don't lift it up into the air, because that would be probably impossible with like a 100-ton mech like the Atlas, but they lift it enough and provide enough upward force that it takes the pressure off of the joints and stuff, so that they can start working on the mech without needing to worry about structural issues or misalignment problems. And from there, they can do pretty much whatever they need. A fully functional mech bay in 3025 has all of the heavy equipment and industrial stuff that you would need to take the armor off, remove pieces of the mech, even fully rebuild it if limbs or parts or components get shot off the mech in combat. Most modern mech bays have the ability to relatively easily, if pretty goddamn slowly, put that stuff back together or manufacture, repair, fabricate brand new replacements and slap it on, right? The only thing that modern mech bays can't really do is work quickly. Again, because automation is not really a thing that's around much. In fact, the image that I showed you is probably like one of the most advanced mech bays that the Inner Sphere would have at, like the Canon 3025 time span. That kind of fully automated repair bay with all of the hoists and all of the different stuff to work on a mech, that's like Star League era tech. Those are very rare and very hard to come by. The funny part, though, the really good part, is when you have to repair mechs in the middle of buttfuck nowhere with whatever you've got. Duct tapes and dreams, baby. That's all you got. So let's see if I can find just my favorite 2 images of these guys working on an archer. Oh, here we go. Here's one. Here's an overall image, right? This is a really good example of what most frontier mechs actually have for, repair and rearmament. They have nothing fancy. Most of them don't even have a mech bay. It's basically whatever open area they have, whatever resources they have, and whatever man lifts that they can scrounge together to get their technicians and engineers to wherever they need to be to actually operate on the mechs. So in this scenario, you have an archer, which is the heavy mech that you can see pictured here, just standing in the middle of a military base, in the middle of some muddy field, probably in the ass end of nowhere on a planet nobody has ever heard of, and it's getting its leg repaired. Maybe it took some damage, maybe it was just dodgy coming out of the factory and it needs some maintenance, maybe they're rebuilding it, who knows, but it's just sitting there, fully under its own weight, with only that singular crane there hoisting up the mechanical bit, like I said, the best you can hope for. And this is pretty much what most mech techs have to work with. It is brutal, slogging, terrible work, and it is extremely taxing, because mech components will break down and wear out a lot faster when this is the kind of maintenance that you can do. You'll put a lot of stress onto the joints. It'll be extremely difficult to really maintain or repair them effectively. It's very difficult to ship components and replacements out to a lot of these military bases. If you're not close to an industrial world or your unit isn't well supplied with spare parts, there's a really good chance you're not getting any. Here we go. Here's Billy Bob standing by the foot of that archer, trying to take off the armor panel. Look at him there with his big, arc cutter or whatever, trying to remove that piece of armor. That's what the dude has. They don't have those big fancy robot arms with the giant plasma torches on them that can cut this stuff off. No, he's got to be there with a handheld welder, trying to pull this massive armor piece off.
And it's got some good old elbow grease to get that shit done.
The armor plating is thicker than that guy is, and he's supposed to cut through it. Poor dude, man. He's got the worst job in the army. So when it comes to actual combat, right, here's just a cool picture of battle for no reason. That's a Centurion, by the way, my favorite mech. My favorite medium mech ever. It's so cool. They tend to get really screwed up. As you can see, mechs that go into combat tend to come up missing bits and pieces, with much of it looking like it just crawled out of a volcano, melted and slagged to hell. And in-field repair and rearmament operations are really important, because in a lot of cases, if a mech takes so much damage, it's not walking back to a factory. It's not returning to rear line echelons and finding a way to get repaired there. It's stuck on the front line, and that's where these come in. These are makeshift mech bays. This is literally ripped straight out of a game. They are designed as little miniature industrial mech bays. They've got the same overhead gantry support, as you can see the large scaffolding, to have those robotically assisted maintenance bays. They have a lot of the stuff that you would find in a proper mech bay, the tools, the support, the power generation to keep the mech running, and of course, some of them, the more advanced ones at least, operated by like Comstar and stuff, will have miniature mech hoists, the ability... Here's another example of one of these prefab mech bays that you would find on the front lines. It's not super glamorous, the stuff is relatively minor, but it's a safe, generally isolated area that mech techs can work on repairing and rearming mechs. They are armored to a limited degree, and when I say limited, basically just enough to stop flak, explosions, shrapnel, and small arms. If there are bombs going off nearby, if it's being strafed by planes and stuff, it can generally withstand that. No, it can generally withstand that. Yeah, no, it can. It can withstand that kind of stuff. If it's getting directly hit by large caliber like artillery, or someone dropped a bomb directly through the open door, then it's probably going up in smoke. But remember, a lot of these prefab mech bays you find on the front lines will have ammunition and weapons stored in them as well, in case the mechs need to rearm rather than just repair. Yeah, they need to be armored enough that some random shrapnel from an artillery shell isn't going to blow the whole thing sky high. That's pretty much most of what I have to say, by the way.
Okay. I wasn't really sure how to follow that up.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's pretty much everything. Like, yeah, but that's pretty much it. The only other thing I would like to say is a thank you to Science Insanity as a whole. Thank you to all the viewer. Oop, didn't mean to click that. Thank you to...
Order to rebuild.
Fuck, I didn't mean to click that either.
Must have been. Thank you to Canadian for clicking all the wrong buttons. I mean, it's one of the more eventful ones that we've had.
I'm tabbing over to different things because I'm like trying to get to my channel page so I can see what the progress we have is. Big thanks to all the people who have been supporting the channel. The last video we did, the Mercury Battlestar, that's like 3,100 views and growing. It's one of our better performing videos. If it keeps going, it's got like 30, 40 views per hour. It's really making progress. So to all the people that stopped by, everyone that's been watching the content, thank you all very much. The channel's been growing like crazy. I appreciate it greatly. Things are going really well. Once we hit 1,000 subscribers, I think I might take this a little more seriously. We might open like a Patreon or something. Start offering rewards or stuff. What do you think, Steve?
I think we will, yeah.
Perhaps
something that we'll look into doing.
Yeah, because one thing I was thinking once we hit, you know what, we'll poll the community for everyone that made it this far. Thank you very much, and get your opinion. I wanted to open a Patreon, and I wanted to use the money that the community gives to commission artwork once, maybe twice a month, depending on how much money is sent in, and give you guys back a little bit of a reward there, some awesome artwork you can use from different sci-fi universes, featuring yours truly, the idiot duo here as a centerpiece, and allow you guys to vote on what future videos you'd like to see made. So if you think that's interesting or that would be good for Patreon, then let us know down below, and if not, I'm sorry for having terrible ideas.
Then I don't get apologized to when you have terrible ideas to me.
Yo, it's because you're stuck in this absolute rodeo with me. You don't get an apology. You agreed to be here.
Damn.
All right, that's everything. Video's over. Goodbye.
Goodbye.